You know KrisAnne Hall by now. We always give her very, very nice bios and introductions. Author, educator, a veteran, so many things that you provide for this, not only this show, but the larger American audience. You are on the ground. You are one of those boots on the ground. We need more people like you, and you're creating more people like you, KrisAnne. That is the important thing.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. So how are you enjoying Liberty First University?
I'm loving it. Now, I lost my password a couple of weeks ago. I got all that figured out there, but
good.
but either way, I'm loving it, and I'm always encouraging people, especially around this time of year. I know that American history knows no season, but we're starting to get to the very, very patriotic Independence Day time of the year. It's warm outside. Everybody should be checking out Liberty First University, getting loved ones on, getting children on there. So absolutely, 100%. Thank you for everything you do.
Well, thank you for not saying 4th of July.
Yes, Independence Day. I know.
That is a huge pet peeve of mine.
Well, it's the fireworks day, but aside from that, you have drilled it into our heads quite a few times. July 2nd is the date.
Yes, that's right.
Well, you know what? Tonight I have a topic that, I think that nobody is going to be unfamiliar with the way that the media has really hawked in on this. By the way, since the last time you came on, now Nevada has become the 15th state to join the popular vote compact to skirt around the Electoral College. So we're adding another one on there. That seems to be a recurring theme too. But
well, here's the thing. I'm not sure if people will know this, but the Constitution prohibits states from creating interstate compacts unless those compacts are approved by Congress. So this is an unconstitutional contract between the states unless Congress approves it.
So ultimately, when 2020 shows up, and the popular vote goes one way or another, if they actually get the results they want to actually have this compact go into full effect and pledge all of their electoral college votes, is that something that would eventually be, they're hoping, would be contested over the course of weeks and months in the Supreme Court, holding up then maybe the announcement of who even won?
It's possible. I mean, there's a lot of things that are possible. The whole thing is nothing but a complete scam to begin with. The idea that Americans within our states would actually agree to something like this is proof that we know nothing. That these people know nothing about our Constitution, know nothing about what a constitutional republic is, and more so, know nothing about what a true democracy is. Because if these people knew what a true democracy is, they would be fighting to prevent it, not trying to usher it in. A true democracy is slavery, because a true democracy dictates that the majority rules over the minority, and then we're back to masters and slaves.
Yeah. And that was the thing that I brought up last time there too, just in analyzing why would a state say we want to surrender our right to take our votes and to choose ourselves and to actually honor the votes of the people in our state, to say that the popular vote from maybe 3 or 4 cities outside of our jurisdiction is going to dictate what we do with our votes. It just seems so un-American in the way that they surrender.
Well, yeah, it is, because they're ignorant of what, who we really are and the destruction they're bringing about themselves. See, this is the thing. These people pushing for the national popular vote, well, let me put it this way, because the people who are pushing for the national popular vote, the people who actually know what they're doing, right? Because over the course of history, people in power love democracies, right? Because it's nothing more than the mob rule. And people in power know that 1 or 2 can actually control a mob as long as you can keep the mob distracted with shiny things or angry things, right? So you keep them chasing phantoms, and they'll do whatever you want. It's really, really the behavioral science of herding animals, and that's how mobs work. Mobs don't think like rational thinking human beings. mobs think like primitive animals. And so people in power always know that. So the people who are pushing the national popular vote, they want to be tyrants. And they know this is the perfect way to do this. But the people who are buying into national popular vote have no clue. They have no idea whatsoever, Frank, that of the consequences of what they are agreeing to. I bet 90% of them have no idea that their vote means absolutely nothing at all unless they live in a few choice cities.
Yeah. No, I'm sure
tell
they
you
don't.
it's, well, we're a democracy and it's one voice, one vote, and my voice needs to be heard. And I sort of look at them, I want to look at them in the face and say, you know what? If you want your voice to be heard, you're doing the exact opposite of what needs to be done.
Yes. If you want your voice to, I always thought, I used to talk about that too, especially on a local level. You want your voice to be heard. First of all, you got to put down whatever the hell you're working on and you are distracting yourself with, and get involved in some kind of a local fashion. You can so easily, a person can so easily impact the way that a local, their town or their village or their city can see an issue, or at least have a new voice put into the mix. But now that we're so nationally focused on everything, it sounds so, I don't know. It's inconceivable that people think that their vote would actually matter on that kind of a scale, which is why it was broken down in this way to begin with. And that's just one of the things that concerns the hell out of me. So we'll see what happens. We're another year away. That would be amazing to see if after the census, all of those votes that padded the popular vote actually go away, and Donald Trump actually wins the popular vote the second time around. That would be really great.
See, that's what I'm looking for, because history tells us that the popular vote statistically does not go the way of those who are pushing for the popular vote. So I'm anticipating the view of the popular vote. The only thing that really concerns me, Frank, is that who counts the vote controls the vote. And if we go by popular vote, I think voter fraud will actually be worse than it already is.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Now, on to the main topic of tonight, because it just happens to be that every time you come on, another state joins into that little compact. So I wanted to bring it on up. But, last time you called in, it was Colorado. But lately, whether it is Jerry Nadler from New York or Nancy Pelosi from California, whoever the hell it is, they're talking about obstruction. They're talking about they're talking about a number of things, but the biggest thing that they are warning us about is that we are approaching the point of constitutional crisis. We're not there yet. We're approaching it, and we need to be very, very upset about this and very worried about whether or not we would slip into a state of crisis. Now, I think it's really funny that anybody who stands by the policies that they do and wields power the way that they do, the ones who are actually standing by ideas like expanding the Supreme Court and trying to get around the Electoral College without amending the Constitution, they are saying that we are approaching a constitutional crisis here. Would you be able to put into terms what exactly a crisis would be? Is there any one way to define what a crisis would be? And we can just start with that.
Well, let me ask you a question, Frank. Have you ever heard of a term called of situational ethics?
Situational ethics? No. But is it as self-explanatory as it sounds?
Yeah, it is. Situational ethics means that your ethics are relative to the situation.
Yes.
Exactly the way it sounds. So one day you're moral and pious, and the next day your moral piety is something different because you're trying to achieve a different goal, right? Mm-hmm. So I have taken that principle and applied a new term to people like Nadler and Pelosi and them. I call them situational constitutionalists because they're not really interested in the Constitution. So the only time they want to be constitutionalists, worried about the Constitution, is when it fits their kind of goal. Just like the only time people who use situational ethics want to be ethical is when it fits their agenda, and that's the same thing that's going on here. The interesting thing is it says they're approaching a constitutional crisis. I had a conversation. Actually, Frank, you tweeted out that we were going to be talking about this, And there were several people on Twitter throwing out dates, wondering, well, when did the constitutional crisis start? And so I just want to simply tell the people, we began approaching a constitutional crisis in 1833. And I know we've talked about this before on your show, but it's in 1833 that we began approaching a constitutional crisis, because in 1833 we stopped teaching the truth about the Constitution. And we stopped teaching the Constitution in institutions of higher education. Your post-secondary schools stopped teaching it properly. Now they don't teach it at all. And so we started approaching that constitutional crisis the moment we set aside our proper training on the Constitution, and that happens in 1833. So all of those who were talking to me on Twitter about that, then there you go. There's your answer. We started approaching constitutional crisis in 1833. As a matter of fact, you can actually step forward a little bit earlier in 1792. I mean, that's not even much past the creation of the Constitution. You have James Madison, who we know as the father of the Constitution, but in 1792 he was Representative James Madison in the House of Representatives, representing his district in Virginia. And James Madison warned Congress that the actions that they were voting to take would transmute our America from the constitutional republic that they created to, he said, at best, a limited monarchy. And so as unfortunate as it is, from the time we ratified the Constitution, the people began electing people that were who wanted to drive us in the wrong direction. And I think that's because of a cultural thing, Frank. You see, coups violently overthrow governments. And that's what we had. We had a revolution. We had a violent coup that overthrew Great Britain as our governmental leadership. Now, that's how that happens. The problem is violent coups can overthrow leaders, but they cannot change the culture. And so what we did was we overthrew leaders, but the culture of servitude remained. And so while we had some very, very brilliant people in America who wanted to drive us in the right direction, we were also surrounded by people who still wanted a king, even if it was proverbial. You know, they still wanted to be taken care of by government. So that's always been the struggle for America. And so we have this situational constitutionalism. What does a constitutional crisis look like, though, right? Well, it looks like a president of the United States who can declare war. A constitutional crisis looks like a Department of Justice that is not bound by the limitations of the Fourth Amendment. It looks like a Congress that can write whatever law they choose, as long as they can get a majority of congressmen to accept it. And it looks like a Supreme Court that has been declared to be the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution. I had some Twitter tweet on try to explain to me that the Supreme Court's job was to tell us what the Constitution is. Now, I've heard professors say that, right? Yeah. As a matter of fact, I was sitting in federal court in Kansas, where a federal judge said to us, as a part of the delivering of his decision in a case, he says, and I'm quoting him, it is seared in my brain, Frank. This federal court judge said, the Constitution says what I say it is. So that's a constitutional crisis.
Oh, wow.
And we could go on. We could go on for hours. A constitutional crisis is a federal government that takes money from people and distributes it to other people. A constitutional crisis is a government that takes things from people and provides housing for other people. And James Madison wrote an essay called Property in 1798 that described what he called an unjust government when it comes to the property rights of the people. And today, our federal government fulfills every single criteria that James Madison set forth as an unjust government.
You know, Nancy Pelosi, I think it was today or yesterday, invoked Thomas Jefferson to talk about how he was looking at the Louisiana Purchase as a way of infrastructure and central planning and all that stuff, so they invoke history in the most very weird ways. And when you go back to 1792, are you talking about the Militia Act? Because I've heard the Washington administration brought up as far as the Militia Act, the Whiskey Rebellion. Then, of course, there's a lot of First Amendment issues that have been brought up in things that I have read and conversations I've been in with President Adams and the Alien Sedition Act. Of course, Lincoln and habeas corpus. And then, of course, I mean, if you want to go to because I saw some of those tweets that people were sending you. I saw 1912 or 1913 thrown out at you as a question as whether or not that was. I guess they're talking about the 16th Amendment and the federal.
17th Amendment
yes,
and everything.
And the Federal Reserve. But I mean, if you were going to look in the 20th century, I don't know, you would have a field day with FDR's administration.
Yeah, no doubt. You just threw like 6 questions at me, Frank. No fair.
No, okay. Sorry for me. So Washington and Adams, just our first two, as far as.
Well, here's the thing. 1792. I was speaking of the cod fishery debate, and I think what we need to understand. I mean, this is prior to the Whiskey Rebellion and all of that stuff, which, by the way, Washington got really bad advice on and wrote later how he repented on what he was talked into doing for the Whiskey Rebellion. He believed that he was absolutely wrong in organizing troops to quell the Whiskey Rebellion. But in 1792, I don't know how many people know this in history, but after we won our independence from Great Britain as a government never recognized our independence. So from that time of officially winning the war for independence, Great Britain was still acting like we were their colonies. As a matter of fact, they sent the British Navy over to come and kidnap our men to serve in the British Navy because they said, you're still British citizens, so you still have an obligation to serve in the British Navy. And they also sent over their fishing crews, and they had decimated our cod fishing industry on the coast. So what happened is Congress got together and said, hey, we have this crisis. The Great Britain has taken all of our codfish. The cod fishing industry here in America is failing. All these cod fishermen are suffering and their families are suffering. And it's our fault because we didn't defend the shores. So here's what we need to do. We need to collect tax dollars from the people, and we need to subsidize these fishermen until the industry recovers. Well, James Madison gave an amazing oration that day and simply said, and I'm not going to give you the whole thing, but simply said, look, that is not what general welfare means. That is not what necessary and proper means. That is not what common defense means. There is absolutely no delegation in the Constitution for the federal government to provide subsidies to industries. And he says the proposition that you make, the latitude that you call for in the power of Congress is well beyond anything that the Constitution delegates. And he says, I warn you, if you take this step, you will go down a path of no return, and you will expand the federal government's power to be an unlimited power, limited only by whatever Congress can call in need of money. He says, because if you can define the general welfare clause to mean money, then there will be no limit to the power by which the federal government can exercise. There's actually, Frank, there's an article on my website, KrisAnneHall.com, called James Madison. I don't know the full title, but it's General Welfare Clause Not About Money. I think that's pretty what it is. General Welfare Clause Not About Money. If you go to KrisAnneHall.com and read that article, you can see specifically what Madison said and specifically what he warned. And I guarantee you, before you're halfway through the small portion of the speech that I put on there, you will have goosebumps at how much of a prophet Madison actually was.
I mean, well, if you look at I mean, hindsight is 2020, absolutely, but then again, it's just common sense there too, and I think that
Well,
is what's.
he wasn't even using hindsight.
I know,
I mean,
what he was using was just an intimate knowledge of the nature of human beings as animals. This is just
and
this is just what it is.
yeah, he knew from history that this is how people work. And not only that, he knew specifically, okay, this man is in history known to be the father of the Constitution. He knew specifically what the Constitution, the powers the Constitution delegated and the powers they did not delegate. And he's looking at Congress and saying, we never authorized this. How dare you do this already?
Already. Right out of the gate. The other thing I love what you said, and it's it just reaffirms a lot of the things that we've been talking about on this show when we pay any attention to what phase in the game we are with this Russia investigation, which is really just a ruse, and it's being used in such a weird way, especially now it's been depleted of all of its believability. But still, what I've said on this show many times before is what we really need to be doing is concentrating on educate. That's why I love having you on. We need to talk about the culture. We need to talk about who we really are. We need to talk about natural law, because it doesn't matter to me if we drive out all of these seditious traitors out of the government. It doesn't matter to me if the halls of Congress is completely cleaned out and we have a new crop of people that come in that maybe for the time being we might be able to trust. It just doesn't matter if the culture is what is producing this, is what is forgiving this, and maybe it's just forgiving it out of ignorance of not knowing what it should not be forgiving. And I think that was just so great, where what was still relevant and what was a detriment to us a century or two ago is still relevant and even more of a detriment to us now. And you said, no, in 1832, when you said that we were approaching 1833, when we were approaching a constitutional crisis on the basis of education, what exactly was being taken out of, what was being perverted in college or higher education that was leading to more liberal ways of, and when I say liberal, I mean more, whatever goes, whatever we can get the votes for will be constitutional. What was being taken out of education at that time, or what was being perverted in particular?
Okay, well, the Constitution was being rewritten, not through amendment process, but through education. Okay, so from the ratification of the Constitution to 1833, our post-secondary education, because remember, most people were homeschooled. There was no public school, that sort of thing. So in the universities where formal education mostly existed, they used a textbook, a handbook on the meaning and application of the Constitution written by one of the members of the Continental Congress. His name is St. George Tucker. And in 1833, now this is where the Whiskey Rebellion comes in. This is where the nullification crisis comes in. This is where the great debate between Daniel Webster and Mr. Haynes comes in. You see, there was an exercise, a proper exercise of the structure of our constitutional republic, where the states were exercising an external control over the federal government. So when the federal government, between the ratification of the Constitution in 1833, when the federal government stepped outside of its delegated authorities, it was written in the solutions that the external check and balance of the states who created the federal government would have the authority, either as a group or individually, to step up and say, look, you can't exercise that power. We never delegated it to you. And since you're trying to exercise a power that's not been delegated to you, it's null and void here. So we're not going to enforce this, and neither are you. And there was a very good, it is the greatest, James Madison called it the greatest check and balance on earth. And it was working. The problem is those in power didn't want it to work. So in 1833, they surreptitiously took the handbook to the Constitution written by St. George Tucker out of the post-secondary schools and replaced it with a new handbook written by a man named and his name just flipped out of my head, Joseph Story. And Joseph Story was a Supreme Court justice who wrote this new handbook on the Constitution, which rewrote the Constitution through interpretation. It established the Supreme Court as being the ultimate authority. It established that the states were in some places co-equal with the federal government, in other places beneath the federal government. And it was at that time that the coup to overturn the sovereignty of the states actually began. The Civil War, not as a war to end slavery, because there were two wars fought at the same simultaneously. There was a social war and a political war. So not referencing the social war to end slavery, but the Civil War, the political war, would never have been possible without the transformation in the educational system in 1833.
Wow. See, that's something, and I've done a lot of diving into the Civil War, and that's one aspect that is rarely ever. Actually, I've never heard it mentioned until now. We talk about it's usually all about the moral tariff and the agricultural and the economic differences between North and South, taxation situation, and of course, nothing in the early goings really ever said anything about slavery until 1863. That became a little bit more prevalent then. But this is the first time I've ever had the Civil War start in 1833 in very subtle ways that nobody probably would be able to predict, but still there is a root.
Well, if you want to get into the real study of it, you need to begin with something called the Great Debate. And it's a debate between two House members, Webster and Haynes. And this is where the movement to change the Constitution actually began. And they knew they couldn't amend it. They knew they couldn't rewrite it. So the best way to change the law without rewriting the law is to educate the judges and lawyers to interpret the law differently than what the founders intended. And so the beginning of this transformation, or at least let me put it this way, the beginning of the need and the recognition by those who wanted to consume the power that we needed to make this change was in the Great Debate of 1830.
Well, I have to definitely. Do you have courses just on that at Liberty First?
I have a course. I have a course on the General Welfare Clause, but I haven't developed a course on that yet. That is part of what's coming up this fall. I haven't really told many people this, Frank, so this is a secret, okay?
Nice.
I've accepted a position at a university in Tampa, Florida. My husband and I moved down here. It's a university that's been around for a while, actually for a couple, 15, 20 years now. But now they're developing a school of government that will contain a pre-law program, which will eventually become a law school. And so they brought me in to develop this curriculum, and we start our first set of classes in fall.
Oh man, hearing that is that's just music to my ears. I want more. That would be great, just to have any kind of. We're
going to keep the radio show. We're still going to be traveling and teaching. We're just not going to be traveling and teaching as much as we used to. We simply, seriously, we simply could not keep that pace up. 260 classes in 22 years every single year. 7 years was long enough for that. But now what we're doing is we're now reaching people who are invested in becoming involved in government to get into to consume and become the experts on the constitutional truth as if the founders themselves were teaching it, and then go into the system and tear it down from the inside out and restore America's constitutional republic through by tearing down the error of the system.
Sounds so refreshing, and I'm happy. I'm happy that's because your work already is so important, and I love how you've really just your entire family has just dedicated yourselves to it, and now to have this. So obviously, a lot of your independent work will probably be done in seasons where the school's not in session, maybe summertime tours or something like that.
Well, actually, the school, the founder of the school it doesn't want us to stop completely. So we will be traveling all year round like we did before, just not as much.
Oh,
And
nice.
while we're on the road, yeah, while we're on the road, my students will have will either FaceTime classes or they'll have videos to watch. But what's exciting to me is that the university has a television studio, and and we have access to that studio. So now, when we do the Quite Frankly show in the future, you'll be able to see me because
Oh,
I can
wow.
do it in the studio, and all of our podcasts will be done in that studio as well. So it's really going to cut us up a notch. And then all the courses that we record for the new courses that we record for Liberty First University will also be done on that studio. So we're really, really ramping things up a notch here.
Well, that sounds just so fantastic. And also remember, anytime that you're in the New York area and you need a studio to do a episode on the road, you should just give me a call and I can engineer it for you if you want.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
so you have a studio in New York, just let me know. I just one last thing. I had a couple of questions. I mean, obviously, these are probably just going to be rhetorical questions at this point because you went into such depth about what really a constitutional crisis is. So, forgive me if these are rhetorical, but still, they're a little bit more contemporary. I had a friend of mine ask me. He said he gave me a couple of things he wanted me to ask you, and then about constitutional crises in general, and says, wants to know, is the attack on the executive branch powers by the House Democrats itself a constitutional crisis? For instance, people like Adam Schiff and Mark Warner, aside from leaking classified information, were knowingly participating in an unlawful attempt to remove a president. Is that not a crisis in itself?
I would say it this way, and I don't know if somebody's going to argue this is semantics, but I would say it this way. I would say it's the symptom of the crisis we're already in.
The culture.
Yeah, it's a symptom. It's like why do I have this rash, right? Well, you don't have a rash because you have a rash. You have a rash because there's something in your body that's going wrong. We have a political coup occurring in America. That's not the crisis. That is the result of the crisis.
Great point. A really great point. And yeah, like after everything we did, I know that. Hey, can a sitting congressperson be charged or indicted criminally?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to ask. One last question. This is a little bit off topic,
Okay.
but still has to do with our Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. And this is from a article today from the New York Times that has to do with Julian Assange. And he's been indicted under Espionage Act and raising now First Amendment issues. What do you think? What do you think about this? He's been indicted on 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act for his role in obtaining and publishing secret military and diplomatic documents in 2010. Now, what are your thoughts on publishing of sensitive information and Mr. Assange in general and all that? Do you think that this is a worthy pursuit, or is this something that's not gonna be good for our rights to point out when things are going wrong, especially when we're seeing how rotted from the inside out everything is? I don't know. A lot of people are starting to think that the paths that have been laid out for whistleblowers to point out wrongs that need to be righted are not sufficient enough. So, being that he is just the publisher, what do you think about this from a constitutional standpoint?
Well, from a constitutional standpoint, the whole purpose of freedom of press is not so you can go around and say things that make the government feel good. The whole purpose of freedom of press is so that you can expose the government, those in government. You can disagree with those in government, and you can educate others about the wrongdoings of those in government. And if government can define what is allowed to be published and what is not allowed to be published based on what they like and what they don't like, then once again we have another result of the constitutional crisis in America, the constitutional crisis of ignorance about, the whole purpose of freedom of speech and freedom of press and the right to peaceably assemble.
So if Julian Assange gave you a call tomorrow and said, Mrs. Hall, I would love for you to represent me in American court, would you take the case?
Well, I would tell him, Mr. Assange, I would love to represent you in court, but I don't take cases anymore, but I'd be more than happy to be a consultant and even write a brief to help you out.
And that's what you did. Didn't you operate in some kind of capacity like that for the Bundy case as well?
No, actually, I didn't do any consulting for them, to be honest with you.
Oh.
But I did actually practice when I was back practicing First Amendment law, or practicing law and taking cases. I practiced First Amendment law for several years.
Oh, well, then if you were still taking cases, you would have been the person to call then.
I would hope so.
Well, KrisAnne, thank you so much for the time tonight. We've had both Liberty First University and KrisAnneHall.com up on the screen. I hope everybody goes and visits you and keeps track of your work. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave anybody with? Any parting shots? Any plugs for any new projects or releases you got coming out?
We are really, really so very consumed with the transition. We just moved to Tampa on Monday of this week, so we are trying to get everything together. And I would just ask those who love us to pray for us and to be patient with us as we move through this transition, and to be expecting in hearts and minds to see great things happening. And I would also love to encourage people, please, 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 make sure that you take education. Like, go to KrisAnneHall.com. I'm sure you have lots of things that educational resources they can use. Become a member at LibertyFirstUniversity.com and really, really, really take to heart the responsibility to teach. We have a motto, Frank: don't just pontificate, educate.
That's a great one. That's a great one. And I'm so happy for all the new opportunities that are opening up for you guys over there. You all very well deserved, and especially with all the very positive energy you put into everything. Much needed, and thank you for everything, KrisAnne. We'll talk to you soon. I can't wait for the June appearance now.
I know, great. Thank you.
All right, have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
And there you go. Another good one. Another